So welcome everyone to the Great Minds, Great Spaces speaker series. I know that veterans of the series have heard this maybe like 6-7 times, but please be patient with me. We often have new people in, so I want to make sure that they understand the general gist of what we have going on here, yeah? My name is Christelle Hales, and pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm so happy that you are all here. As always, to familiar faces in the crowd, I say thank you and welcome back. To new faces, I'm excited that you've joined us here today, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at future events. The Great Minds, Great Spaces is dedicated to working towards infusing themes of diversity, equity, and inclusion into our daily conversations and thought processes. Every session, we bring a speaker to share their expertise on how DEI infuses STEM and vice versa. I'm confident that with crowds like this, having the conversations we are about to have, we will learn just how impactful we can be as a community. We'll get started in just a moment, but before we dive in, there are a couple things you should know. One, for those of you who brought 2 friends to participate in the WPI giveaway opportunity, find me after the session in the back, where I will be handing them out. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, do not fret. You can find the details of this opportunity in the RSVP confirmation email I sent you. Or you can just email me and I can send it. If you didn't participate in this session, you can participate in any of the next ones as supplies last. 2, this event is being recorded for those who may not be able to be present but still want to engage and participate. If you have any kind of issue with that, please pull me aside and let me know. Sorry, I never know how to like. 3, the next Great Minds, Great Spaces will be November 7th, 2019 in Higgins Hall. This session is special and near and dear to my heart, primarily because it is in conjunction with the First Year Initiative program being run out of residential life through Matt Foster. Secondly, through community feedback, we are bringing back Cedric Borsapot, who presented the Black Geek Great Minds, Great Spaces session last year. This year, he'll be talking about his experience as a first-generation student, faculty, and staff member in STEM education. Lastly, we have the Great Minds, Great Spaces sessions during the lunch hour because we understand that everyone's busy and we want to make sure you get fed. But so during this session, if you need to get up, get more food, or get to your next destination, that is completely fine. We just ask that you please be respectful of those around you and do so as quietly as possible. Now, without further ado, I'd like to present our speaker, Evan Brunell. Evan is the Assistant Director of Communication Strategy for WPI's Undergraduate Enrollment Services. He was an entrepreneur who started the first online sports media company and a national baseball journalist prior to focusing on strategic communications. He was president of Mass AG Bell, a state nonprofit focused on serving deaf children, for 5 years, and is a regular presence in presenting leadership and self-advocacy to professionals and families in the deaf community. Evan is profoundly deaf with 2 cochlear implants, raised in a listening and spoken language model. As a colleague and ally, Evan is always willing to support in any way that he can, and it is such an honor to have him speak. Please join me in welcoming Evan Brunell.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Glad to be here. So I'll get started, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. But if we don't, please feel free to come up to me after or email me any follow-up questions you have. So I'll skip over most of my biography because Christelle just gave it. For those who are not aware of the Office of Undergraduate Enrollment Services, this is an office that supports the Office of Student Aid and Financial Literacy, Pre-Collegiate Outreach Program, and Undergraduate Admission. As she said, I'm orally deaf, and we'll get into what that means. I have 2 cochlear implants, although you only see me with 1 on today because one of them is broken, and my replacement is currently flying from California here. So I'll come home to it tonight. I'm also married to a hearing wife, and I'm expecting my first child in a month. Thank you. So, first lesson for you is what I just said, that I was married to a hearing wife. That is the term that the deaf community uses for the majority population who is hearing. So obviously the majority population did not need to self-identify themselves as hearing, but this is the term that we use to help differentiate. It's very often that we in the deaf community, when we hear about people, one of our first questions is he or she deaf or hearing? So before we get started, I would like to challenge you to do something that I do every day. I'd like to take you through an exercise of understanding people. So in this example I'm going to give you, someone has asked you a question, and it's your job to figure out what that question is. If you think you know the answer at any time, just raise your hand and we'll see if you figured it out. So this is the process that I deal with every day. And hearing capability for deaf people vary per person, as we'll touch on again, but this is a pretty good approximation of what it is like for me to communicate with somebody. So someone has asked you the question, using hearing capability, this is what you hear as a deaf person. Vowels come through most prominently orally. That is why you only see vowels here. But as I mentioned, every deaf person is different, and what they hear is different. For example, I can hear consonant. I can differentiate my name, Evan, from Mark, even though both of them have an A. But I do make plenty of mistakes when I only rely on my hearing. My wife never lets me live down the time. She asked me one day a few years ago, do you want some more food? And I said, I love you too. So, thank you, but do you want more food? So, hearing capability, this is what you've been asked. And now you lip read. And at the opposite of hearing, it's easier to lip read consonants. You have pronounced movement of lip for consonant. But again, it's not perfect because there are many different lip shapes. Consonants are formed in different variations depending on what precedes it. And there are different accents too that cause confusion. So this is the lip reading section of the question you've been asked. You put them together, you combine them. This is now the combined question that you were asked. Anybody have any idea what the question is? So what's the next step? The next step is to calculate. The brain uses sensory input to compare lip reading shape to other words in the vocabulary that look similar. So shall, for example, that's not an English word, but shall is, and they form similar visuals on the lips. So that's the first one, and then after you compare lip reading shape to other words and reevaluate your voice content, you apply the context of the situation. For example, we're in the United States. We are not in the United Kingdom. No one in the US is going to ask for a toffee. They're going to ask for a coffee. So we have a pretty good idea now what the question is, but we still can't get the end of it. And this is often where I will stop. This is often times where this is enough for a deaf person to go on. Do we have an understanding of the whole sentence? We do not, but we know enough that we can answer a question. So oftentimes, I will be making decisions based on incomplete sentences, but I now have enough information to make a decision. But we still want to figure out what's being said. So does anybody have any idea what the remaining part of the sentence is? And a sandwich, that's right. It is a sandwich. You use common sense and assumption to fill in the gaps. And that's where you get and a sandwich. But as you can imagine, this is also where mistakes happen all the time. So this is where misunderstanding come in play. And all of this happened instantaneously. This is honed from a lifetime of doing it immediately. There was a slight lag, often lag behind in conversation by a millisecond, but this is all happening automatically. And hearing people do this too. Think about when you're on the phone and you have a bad connection. You're trying to figure out what's being said. The only difference is that I do this every single time a sentence is spoken. So it's a constant, unending process to actively sit through all the inputs to understand one single sentence. And also, this brings up something that we call active and passive listening. I have to actively listen in order for me to understand something. I can't just sit there eating lunch with your back turned to me. Perhaps the acoustics in the room aren't great. You might only be paying attention while on your phone listening to me. That's passive listening. Your subconscious is working to understand, but you are not putting forth actual effort. I have to put forth actual effort all the time to understand. Think about when you were in high school and you were in the hallways and you were gossiping, and you would hear people gossip. You're not even trying to pick things up, you're just trying to get to class. But you're gonna pick things up, you're gonna hear different things. Well, I didn't know any gossip in high school. Fortunately or unfortunately. And actually, my wife was very excited when we started dating, so my wife and I actually went to the same high school, but we did not start dating until after college. She caught me up on all the high school gossip. So lip reading is not 100% accurate. You only get 25 to 30% of what is heard, of what is said, I should say. Of course, there's also auditory input, but not all deaf people can hear or hear well. You also need to know the situation around things. You need to anticipate what's to come. You have body language, you have situational aspect. For example, the question of, do you want to go get a coffee and a sandwich? If I ask that question of somebody, I am now prepared for the answer because I can narrow down the scope of what the response might be, which is also why large social situations are so challenging with everybody talking amongst each other because conversation can change like that. So it's very hard for me to follow. I have to have a more linear approach to following conversation. Also, lip reading is tiring. Active listening is tiring. It's exhausting. I remember, so I went to a school for the deaf up until 6th grade, and then I went into public education. For 6th through 8th grade, every day without fail, after school, I would come home with a splitting migraine. My mom would be ready with medicine and with a warm compress, and I would lie on the couch for an hour until my migraine went away. In high school, lecture-based classes were very difficult. I had an interpreter who mouthed the words to me because I don't know sign language. But concentrating on that all day was exhausting. I used to fall asleep in class. Unfortunately, the teachers knew that I wasn't falling asleep because I was derelict. They knew that I was trying, so I didn't get in trouble for it. But it still made me worry about the perception of me falling asleep in class. Lip reading can also be really socially awkward. I'm always wondering if I'm coming across as nosy or eavesdropping. If I'm sitting here just eating my lunch and someone across the table is talking, I have to think to myself, how's it going to come across if I'm looking at them? I don't want to look like I'm trying to eavesdrop, even though if I could hear perfectly, I would be passively listening to the conversation. A good example I have of misinterpreted intention is in high school, someone came up to me and said, I heard you're interested in so-and-so to be in a relationship. And it came out of left field for me. I was like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about. And you go, well, you keep looking at her lips. It's like you want to kiss her. No, I'm just trying to understand her. And also, we also have the fact that not all deaf people can hear. In fact, the popular stereotype in public life is that deaf people do not hear, but deafness is such a wide spectrum, individual to the person. So you have in front of you a paper that talked a little bit about deafness. I will let that speak for itself, but I will touch on some of these things quickly. So deafness is it encompasses many degrees of hearing loss. And this is actually one reason why the deaf community struggle to advocate as a single unit together, because there are so many disparate elements of deafness, of causes, segments, and things like that, that it's hard to communicate in one single voice. And actually, this is a similar reason to why the disability rights movement lags behind the movement for gender and ethnic equality, is because every disability has its own struggles, its own challenges, its own wants, and it's hard to coalesce together in one voice. The Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed in the 90s was really the first time that this entire group came together. Another thing that's challenging for disabilities is that when people talk about diversity, they often leave people with disabilities out. In fact, there was an article in Inside Higher Ed written a year ago that said that support for diversity for college often does not extend to students with disabilities. And that's because part of the reason is because disabilities lack that singular voice to advocate. So the CDC defines deafness in terms of being unable to rely on hearing to use speech and language. But this is an outdated term because I'm deaf and I am using speech and language and I am relying on my hearing. If you Google what deafness is defined as, you will find many different definitions by many different organizations. It's just not easy to come up with a singular term for deafness. So there are different causes. There's congenital and acquired. Over half are usually due to genetics. We do not know why I'm deaf, but we strongly suspect that it was genetics. There are also different types of blockage and impairment damage. So the reason I am deaf is because the hair cells inside my cochlear do not move. So they cannot send signal to the auditory processing center of the brain. But again, there are so many different reasons you can become deaf, which is what the document in front of you outlines. There are different degrees. There's mild, moderate, severe, and profound. This is not inclusive of hearing aids and communications methods. These degrees are your base level, how you would hear without technology. So for example, I have a profound hearing loss. That means I hear pretty much nothing. The loudest I could hear unaided would be if I was standing next to a jet engine. I would hear that if I was standing right next to it. Otherwise, I cannot hear anything less than that without technology. There are also different segments. There's the hard of hearing, there's oral deaf, myself, there's late deafened, and then there's capital D deaf. So in the deaf population, there are two dominant groups. There's the oral deaf and the capital D deaf. Before I get into that, the late deafened are typically those who, by definition, acquire hearing loss later in life, often after age 64. And then hard of hearing tend to have mild or moderate hearing and can function much like a hearing person with or without assistance. So the oral deaf were born or became deaf early, and they use technology and they practice listening and spoken language, which in the professional community is called LSL. The capital D deaf is a subset of the deaf who cannot or will not hear, who use sign language and consider themselves a cultural community. Even though they are the popular stereotype, it is thought that only up to 6% of the total population of people with hearing loss qualify as capital D deaf. And I keep saying capital D deaf. This is because this community is distinctive from the medical term of deafness. They view themselves as a cultural entity, and we'll get into what that means when I tell you about the deaf war that has been going on for decades shortly. So again, commonly accepted stereotype despite being only 6% of the population. I run into this stereotype all the time, and so does my wife. I remember when she started grad school several years ago, and they were all making introductions and telling anecdotes about their lives, and she mentioned that she was engaged to a deaf person. Didn't think anything of it, and then after class, someone came up to her and said, "So wait a minute, you're with a deaf person?" "Yes, I am." And, "Oh, so you know sign language?" And she said, "No, I don't know it at all." And the other person goes, "So wait a minute, your relationship is strictly sexual then?" Yeah, I mean, I'll take it. So the World Health Organization said that currently over 5% of the world population has hearing loss that qualifies as a disability. However, Gallaudet University thinks that along the continuum of deafness, including late deafened and undiagnosed people with mild hearing loss, it could be up to 14%, half of them who are 64 or over. Fewer than 1 out of 1,000 qualify as profoundly deaf prior to the age of 18. That's myself, so I guess you could say I'm a unicorn. So what are the struggles that a late deafened adult has? It's not too bad. They tend to function normally with hearing aids and cochlear implant. They have long lives with auditory input, and they often are able to adjust very quickly to receiving aid. I would say the most famous, shall we say, late deafened person in public life is Rush Limbaugh. He had 2 cochlear implants, and it often described it as that sound now sounds like a robot is talking to him. But you would never know that he was late deafened. All deaf, as I mentioned, are deaf at early ages, and what they struggle to function the usual way, and also have to deal with unreasonable expectations. Cochlear implants are not a magic pill. They are an aid. They are not a solution. People who I interact with on a regular basis can tell you that I do not hear 100%. Sometimes I misinterpret the question, or I have to ask people to repeat. It is not a magic pill. Cochlear implants also have a very difficult time differentiating noises. All noises are relevant. If there was someone speaking to me and a loud air conditioner going, all I can hear is the air conditioner. There are ways to mitigate this through constant practice of training your brain to reduce the background noise, or with certain accessible equipment that can help reduce it. For example, my cochlear implant has a setting on it that will reduce background noise, and when it rises to the level of a restaurant or driving in the car in the wind whipping by. So one example to illustrate this is we moved into our house about 6 years ago, and we were just sitting there one day watching TV, and there was this sound that was constant, unending, and insanely loud. It was all I could hear, and it was so grating and annoying, I just wanted to pull my hair out. This is when I had hair. So I said to my wife, Sarah, I said, "What is that sound? It's so loud." And she said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "How can you not hear that? It's louder than the TV." She couldn't hear, so we paused the TV, we muted it. She still couldn't hear. She said, "What? Are you hearing cars passing by on the street?" "No, I am not. This is loud." We ended up having to shut all the windows, and she had to sit there in peace and quiet for several minutes. And then it's crickets. It was the crickets outside that were making a racket, and to this day, I cannot stand the sound of crickets. So the skewing of hearing loss in seniors is changing. The fastest growing group of people with hearing loss is under 65, and it is rising among U.S. adolescents. It increased 30% from 1988 to 94 to 2005, 2006. Today, 1 in 5 have hearing loss, whether or not it's diagnosed. By the year 2015, the World Health Organization estimates that at least 10% of the world population will qualify as having a disabled hearing loss. So with that background, we come to the deaf war. So this is the cultural war for self-identity inside the deaf community. We're talking about the capital D deaf that views themselves as cultural versus the little d deaf, which views it as a medical diagnosis. The capital D deaf feel like they're losing their identity in a world of technology and a movement for listening and spoken language. The deaf community since the mid-19th century has had to grapple with the idea of what it means to be deaf when the idea of listening and spoken language began to take hold. This was popularized by Alexander Graham Bell, who was often known as the inventor of the telephone, but his life's work was actually on hearing and speech. And most of his technology was designed to advance that. And he's the totem of the listening and spoken language movement. The deaf nonprofit that I ran for 5 years was the Massachusetts Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, which is a state chapter of a national organization. So for many years, for decades, the idea of oral deaf was actually a hindrance to deaf people because technology just wasn't there yet. But starting in the 1850s, it started to slowly take hold and divided the deaf community between those who felt that deafness was an identity, a cultural identity, and those who viewed it no differently than someone with poor eyesight who needed corrective lenses. Cochlear implants became a game changer, but the past history of the oral deaf education had caused significant mistrust in the community. So as I said, the capital D deaf views itself as a cultural entity. They don't consider themselves disabled. They would actually question why the majority of the hearing majority would view them as different. Just because it's the majority doesn't mean that there's necessarily anything wrong. It's a culture with its own language. You've got American Sign Language, British Sign Language, Italian Sign Language. Just like spoken language has many different types of languages, so the sign language, there are even accents, and there are regional differences. They have their own mode, they have their own traditions. For example, the capital D community tend to be more blunt and critical with hearing counterpart due to the language barrier. The hearing community tend to try to soften criticism, whereas the deaf community is more direct with it to get their point across. The community is very concerned about autism, which is the idea that one is superior based on one's ability to hear. And you will also hear the term oralism thrown around, trying to force a deaf person to change who they are to fit the preconceived notion of the hearing majority. A.G. Bell, for all of his accomplishments, did think that deaf people should not be allowed to marry or to have children. He had deaf parents. He mentored Helen Keller. As I said, he's the totem for the listening and spoken language movement, but he did not believe that deaf people should carry their genes forward. He wasn't alone in that statement. For many years, many years, people equated deafness with being dumb. Deaf and dumb is a very popular term. But deafness doesn't cause a lack of intelligence. It's the linguistic development that was missing for deaf people for all these years, which is why they just immediately thought they were dumb, because they weren't speaking, they weren't responding to sound. It wasn't the absence of sound that was the problem, it was the absence of language. So you can see here an example of the deaf war on both sides. One side is anti-cochlear implants. A happy deaf child using sign language, member of the deaf community, is happy. But after cochlear implants, he's forced into years of intensive speech therapy to try to fit in a hearing world with no chance of being normal. Then you have the opposite end of the spectrum, who view their cochlear implant as an asset, as a way to participate in life. So I am little d deaf. I am orally deaf. I view it as a medical diagnosis. And the capital D deaf people would argue that just because the majority is hearing doesn't mean that hearing is correct. So it caused massive broken relationships. Families have been split apart because of this. My parents, when I was born and they were trying to determine whether to raise me capital D deaf or listening and spoken language, heard from people on both sides and made a decision, and they lost some friend over it who they thought that would survive their decision to raise me orally. So the war has slowly but steadily tilted in the favor of the oral deaf, enhanced by the decision of hearing parents to give child hearing devices. A lot of this is driven by the fact that linguistic development is so important from the ages of 0 to 3, that they feel like they should equip the child with its ability to hear and use spoken language in order to give them options. However, the capital D community will argue that strip the child of agency and that they should come of age before making that decision. And they have a problem with hearing parents trying to fix their child. And they also fear that the cochlear implant will create a false sense of hope, that suddenly the person is magically hearing. And you can see in the last 10 years, there's been a massive transformation in the segment of oral deaf versus capital D deaf people. And this helps explain why the capital D deaf feel like they're under attack. Not only by hearing people who presume to decide for newborn children what their future holds, but also fellow deaf communities who should be part of the community but are not. I have been yelled at by the capital D deaf for daring to use hearing and spoken language because I am now not a member of that community and able to add my voice to that community. But there's a selection bias on both ends. So the capital D deaf are comprised of people who grew up signing and not using hearing, so they think their way is the best, but it also includes people who failed at listening and spoken language, so they can point and say, see, it didn't work for him, it won't work for everybody. And there's a selection bias on my side as well. I am a success story. I can advocate for listening and spoken language because it worked for me, but what about for somebody who it didn't work for? 96% of deaf babies are born to hearing parents who are uninformed and unprepared to raise a deaf child, which is also a major concern for the community. The majority tend to choose outcomes that will make a child a better fit with the family, so hearing parents will naturally choose the listening and spoken language model because that's what the family uses, not necessarily what is right for the child. But there are factors that can hinder the ability to be oral. The amount of auditory information they can receive varies greatly. Socioeconomic conditions have a huge impact because it takes money, it takes time, and a lot of effort to raise a deaf child. Early exposure to language is critical, and the latest research is supporting a bimodal, bilingual approach to combine listening, spoken language, and sign language all in one. This is a very recent development, and slowly the professional and educational world is shifting to accommodate this approach, but it's early days yet, and there are still plenty of arguments on both sides. I'm going to skip ahead of this slide because we're running out of time, and I'd like to give you some anecdotes, some stories of what it's like to be a deaf person rather than some abstract concepts. So these are some memes that I found online. Every time I fly on a plane, I always have a wheelchair waiting for me when I get off the plane. That's because I identify myself as deaf when booking a ticket so that the flight attendant knows that I can't hear in case of an emergency. So why a wheelchair, you ask? Because airports and airplane companies have not updated their system. Anything that gets marked deaf, blind, anything, immediately got categorized by a computer system from the 1980s as disabled. So automatically they will have a wheelchair waiting. I often have to regularly make a choice between following what people are saying or taking notes here at work. It's almost impossible for me to do both at once, which is why I'm always with the computer when I go to meetings, because it's a lot easier to type without looking at the screen than it is to take handwritten notes. I have a friend who I mentor who is in college, and he was telling me a couple weeks ago He said that he got a graded paperback that he got a D on, and he couldn't understand why. And so I encouraged him to go talk to his teacher because he said he studied like crazy, so he did talk to his teacher. The teacher wondered if he had cheated because how could a deaf person possibly know all of the information? The deaf and dumb model that continues to insidiously perpetuate to this day. He has had teachers actively try to obstruct his understanding. A teacher doesn't like being looked at, and he needs to look at him to read lips, so he'll intentionally turn his body not to understand, or will try to block the interpreter's line of sight. It can become a lifelong challenge. Actually, it can't become, it is. It is a lifelong challenge to demonstrate what is possible. And that's tiring. It's exhausting for me, for everybody that I know, to constantly try to be the best example of what a deaf person can be, to show everybody that deaf people can do it. And it's also tiring to feel like you always have to educate people. I grew up with my mom telling me, just fight. And also, you have to tell people about your deafness. You have to educate them, or otherwise you won't spread the word and people won't know. Well, that's great, but I don't want to do it every day. But it falls on me if I feel like I have that responsibility. A lot of people who are deaf also struggle with socially, and this is a quote from Helen Keller that I feel like really does a good job of explaining this. Blindness separates people from things, but deafness separates us from people. The quote here explains Helen Keller's observation in a little more detail. Social skills tend to mature later than hearing peers because hearing people learn rules through incidental listening, for passive listening. You might not be interested in the gossip in the hallways of high school, but you are subconsciously picking up ways on how to act, how to be, how to interact with people. I missed all of that. I'm terrible at small talk, not because I don't want to do it, but I never developed that ability to make small talk. People say that I'm not missing anything by not being able to listen to talk radio on maybe, but you are still subconsciously picking up all these things that paint a wider picture of the world socially for you. Also, myself and other deaf people struggle to follow conversations and meetings, dinners, things of that nature. So often a lot of time people will describe me as quiet. I am not quiet. My wife will stand up here and tell you I am not quiet, but I do come across that way because oftentimes it takes all the energy and effort I have just to follow, let alone participate. And even if I want to participate, I tend to lag behind the conversation because my brain is working to try to figure out what was just said, that by the time I can say something, that window of opportunity is closed and someone else is now talking. So I have to be strategic in socializing. For example, when I go to meetings, I try to show up a few minutes early to sit at the head of the table because I can then look down the table and I can see everybody's mouth. Even if they're on a profile, I have access to that. Whereas if I sat on one side of the table looking at the opposite side, I would lose the ability to read the lips of people to my left, to my right. So the hearing world is not designed for me. It's not designed for any deaf person, and living in that world every day is exhausting, and it constantly puts at the fore the tension of what it means to be a deaf person in a world not designed for me. And that's also a battle for self-identity as well. And it can get old very, very fast. And you know, I will be honest, a couple times a year, I'll just get in a place of just anger and frustration, and people will tell me it's okay, like you have to be used to it, but it's important to burn that off. It's important to release that. So it's a struggle, it's a constant struggle. And being with other deaf people is such a powerful experience because I don't have to worry about what people might perceive me as if I ask them to repeat something. I was the summer camp counselor for deaf children several years ago, and I'll never forget a teen that was reflecting on her experience. She was with other deaf people for the first time, and she said, for the first time ever, I did not feel self-conscious saying what. And that's something that we deal with every day, of trying to decide when to say what and when to ask people to repeat. Frankly, sometimes it's easier just to let something go. I might want to know what's being said, but I can read. Deaf people also have an innate sense of being able to read body language and pick up on the little tells that tell you whether a person might be getting impatient. Even if they may say they're not impatient, body language can give a lot away. So it's a constant push and pull, and I have to hope that I don't laugh if it's a question, which has happened before. So I'll end by a common question I get from allies is, what can you do? What you can do is be aware. It's the little thing, it's the small thing. There was actually someone in this room last year was at a large group meeting with me. The layout was actually very, very similar. It might have even been this very room with these tables. And we walked in, and I was assigned to a seat in the fallback where I would have a difficult time understanding the person at the front and having group conversation, and without prompting, that person looked at me and said, "You should move." And because I had an assigned seat with assigned people at my table, that meant we all had to move. And originally I was hesitant to do that because I didn't want to be that person asking everybody to move, but this person stepped up and asked the table to switch with another table. Those are the little things that make a difference. Currently, it's hard for me to see when my phone is ringing because either I don't hear it, and I do have a visual input into the phone that alerts me when it's ringing, but my attention might be directed elsewhere. I didn't say anything, but suddenly I noticed that all the admins in my office were coming in to tell me when I had a phone call. I didn't have to say anything, but these are the little things that mean a lot. So what can you do? Be aware of the small thing. Walk side by side with me so I can look at you instead of walking ahead of me. Make sure that your face is turned to me. It's all these little things that are noticeable. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
We ask that if you have a question that you just raise your hand and I will come with the mic. And then right now, if you have somewhere to go, you can absolutely go. And then what happens usually after is there'll be a Q&A, some people will leave and some people will linger to come stop and talk with Evan, and that's absolutely fine. Sound good? Yeah. Any questions? Comments? Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. That was a really fantastic talk. I have a question. If somebody is speaking to you, would you prefer they slow down in their speech, or do you take that as an insult?
I wouldn't take it as an insult because that person is trying, but I will say it doesn't help. Think about when someone is speaking to you very slowly or very loudly. It distorts it. I am used to normal speech, so speaking slowly is only going to make it more challenging.
Okay, thank you.
Evan, I actually have a question. What kind of resources do you think can be made available for people to become more aware? Of course, there's Google, right? You can just Google it. But what would you say are the best kind of resources for people to be a little bit more knowledgeable in it? Not just for their personal lives, but also functionally in their jobs, like colleagues and maybe in their departments. What kind of things can they access to be a little bit more inclusive of the deaf community?
Well, I mean, I know you just said that, but honestly, Google is a great resource. There are tons of information out there that you can use. You can also Google for organizations for the deaf, and you can reach out to these organizations, and they have a lot of white papers, a lot of flyers, a lot of documentation either available on their website or that they can send that will provide more information.
Well, Evan, thank you. Everyone.
Thank you.